For many Catholics in Boston, Cardinal Bernard Francis Law was the face of the church. He presided over grand cathedrals, spoke with polished authority, and carried the moral weight of one of the most influential dioceses in the world. He was not accused of abusing children himself. His crime was different and in many ways more devastating. He chose silence, and his silence protected monsters. Bernard Law became Archbishop of Boston in 1984. By then, abuse within the clergy was not an abstract possibility, it was a known reality. Complaints had already surfaced, patterns had already formed, files already existed. Law inherited a system that had learned how to hide its own rot, and rather than dismantle it, he refined it. Under his leadership, abusive priests were not exposed, they were managed. Internal church documents later revealed that Law was repeatedly informed of credible allegations against priests who had sexually abused children. Some priests had multiple victims, some had been reported by parents, some had admitted misconduct internally. The response was almost always the same: quiet reassignment. No police reports, no public warnings, no accountability. One of the most infamous examples was Father John Geoghan, but he was far from the only one. Law approved transfers, knowing full well that the priests posed a danger. In some cases, internal memos explicitly acknowledged the risk, yet the priests were sent to new parishes, new schools, new communities where parents had no idea who they were welcoming. The church's reasoning was consistent and chilling. Reporting abuse would cause scandal. Scandal would harm the church. Therefore, silence was justified. Survivors later testified that when they or their families reported abuse, they were often met with reassurance rather than action. They were told the matter would be handled. They were encouraged to forgive. Some were subtly discouraged from contacting authorities. Others were offered counseling or small settlements in exchange for confidentiality. The goal was containment, not justice. As years passed, the number of victims multiplied. Abuse that could have been stopped continued because the institution believed it could absorb the damage quietly. Each transfer created new victims. Each act of silence expanded the harm. The wall finally collapsed in 2002. Investigative journalists uncovered internal archdiocese documents showing the full extent of the cover-up. The records were explicit. They detailed complaints, evaluations, warnings, and deliberate decisions to protect priests instead of children. The revelation shocked the world and ignited a global reckoning within the Catholic Church. At the center of it all was Bernard Law. Public outrage was immediate. Survivors spoke openly for the first time. Parishioners felt betrayed. Faith communities fractured under the weight of the truth. Law initially defended his actions, insisting he had followed the norms of the time. But the evidence was overwhelming. He had known, and he had chosen silence. In December 2002, Bernard Law resigned as Archbishop of Boston. Too many, it appeared to be accountability. But what followed only deepened the sense of injustice. Rather than face legal consequences, Law was reassigned to a prestigious position in Rome. He retained his title. He retained his status. He lived out his life protected by the very institution whose failures he embodied. For survivors, this was a second betrayal. The message was unmistakable. Even when silence destroys lives, those who enforce it at the highest levels may never face real consequences. The institution closed ranks once more, not around abusers this time, but around the man who had protected them. Bernard Law died in 2017. By then, the damage was irreversible. Thousands of survivors worldwide had come forward. Billions had been paid in settlements. Trust in the church had been fundamentally altered. Yet many felt justice had never truly reached the top. Law's case forces a grim realization. Abuse does not require monsters alone. It requires administrators. It requires signatures. It requires leaders willing to look away. When silence comes from the pulpit, from the bishop's office, from the highest authority, it becomes policy. And policy, when corrupted, destroys lives quietly and efficiently. This case is not about one decision. It is about years of calculated restraint, where reputation outweighed responsibility and faith was used as a shield against scrutiny. And it leaves behind a question that still has no satisfying answer. When the shepherd knows the wolves are among the flock, and chooses silence who is truly guilty, what part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.
He called himself a prophet, a chosen messenger of God. To his followers, Tony Alamo was more than a preacher. He was a savior in a dark world, a man who claimed to hear the divine voice and promised eternal life to anyone who obeyed him. But what lay beneath his holy words was a nightmare of manipulation, greed, and unthinkable abuse. Tony Alamo built an empire of fear disguised as faith, and behind the closed doors of his ministry, he created a world where religion was weaponized to control, exploit, and destroy. Tony Alamo's story began like many cult leaders before him, with charm, conviction, and the perfect pitch for salvation. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Joplin, Missouri in 1934, Alamo moved to California in the 1960s chasing fame as a pop singer. When that failed, he reinvented himself as a man of God, claiming that Jesus had appeared to him and called him to spread his word. It was during this rebirth that he met Susan Lipowitz, a woman as ambitious and controlling as he was. Together, they founded the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation in 1969, headquartered in Hollywood. What began as a small street ministry for runaways and addicts quickly grew into something far more sinister. The Alamos promised spiritual freedom but demanded absolute obedience. Their followers were told to sever ties with their families, surrender their possessions, and dedicate their lives to the church. Those who questioned them were shamed, beaten, or excommunicated. By the mid-1970s, the foundation had relocated to Dyer, Arkansas, where it blossomed into a self-contained community. The Alamos preached daily, broadcast sermons, and ran businesses ranging from construction to clothing manufacturing, all using unpaid labor from their followers. The money poured in, and Tony's control deepened. When Susan died in 1982, something in Tony snapped. He declared that she would be resurrected and ordered followers to pray over her corpse for 6 months, refusing to bury her until the stench became unbearable. He began referring to himself as both prophet and God, claiming Susan spoke to him from heaven. He used fear and scripture to justify every cruelty. Women were told to submit, children were told to obey without question, and anyone who doubted was labeled possessed by demons. Over the next 2 decades, Tony Alamo's ministry evolved into a cult-like compound governed by violence and paranoia. Former followers later described beatings with wooden boards, starvation punishments, and forced labor. Children worked long hours in church businesses, were pulled from school, and taught that the outside world was evil. Alamo's sermons became more apocalyptic and erratic, filled with rants against Catholics, Jews, and the U.S. government. He claimed to be preparing for the end times, building what he called God's kingdom on earth. But behind this divine facade, he was living in depravity, taking underage girls as his spiritual wives. In the 1990s, reports began surfacing that Alamo was forcing young girls, some as young as 9, into marriages with him. He justified it by citing biblical patriarchs who had many wives. Survivors later revealed that he would hold mock wedding ceremonies, declaring the girls his brides and subjecting them to sexual abuse. Parents who resisted were punished, sometimes beaten in front of their children. Federal authorities began investigating, but Alamo was adept at evasion. In 1994, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 6 years in prison after being found guilty of hiding millions in church funds. When he was released in 1998, he rebuilt his ministry, smaller but just as dangerous. His compound in Fouke, Arkansas, became the center of renewed allegations of abuse. Former followers who escaped spoke of nightmarish conditions, of children whipped for minor offenses, of forced fasts that lasted days, and of women kept in fear of eternal damnation. In 2008, the FBI raided the compound. What they found confirmed the horrifying rumors. Evidence of child sexual abuse, physical punishment, and control so total it bordered on psychological slavery. 6 women came forward describing how Alamo had taken them as child brides and assaulted them repeatedly. Some were as young as 8 when the abuse began. During his 2009 trial, prosecutors called him a predator who used the Bible as a weapon. The survivors told harrowing stories of manipulation, how Alamo convinced them that sexual acts were holy and that disobedience would bring God's wrath. One victim testified that he forced her to marry him when she was just 9, taking her on trips where he would rape her in hotel rooms. Another said he told her she was chosen by God and would be cursed if she ever told anyone. The courtroom heard hours of testimony detailing not just sexual abuse, but decades of terror inflicted under the guise of religion. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Tony Alamo on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sex. He was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge called him beyond redemption. Even then, Alamo showed no remorse. In his statement, he railed against the government, claiming he was being persecuted for his faith. To the end, he believed himself untouchable, a prophet above man's law. Tony Alamo died in 2017 in a North Carolina prison at the age of 82. His death closed a chapter in one of the darkest sagas of American evangelical history. But for his victims, the trauma lingers. Many former members still struggle to rebuild their lives after years of indoctrination and abuse. Some remain estranged from family members who are still loyal to Alamo's teachings. Even after his death, remnants of his ministry continued online, spreading his sermons and insisting he was framed by the government. What makes Tony Alamo's story especially chilling is how he turned faith, something meant to heal and uplift, into a tool for domination. He convinced parents to surrender their children, turned prayer into punishment, and built wealth on the backs of those he enslaved spiritually and physically. His followers believed they were serving God. In truth, they were serving a man who saw himself as one. Alamo's legacy is not one of faith, but of fear, a cautionary reminder that charisma without conscience becomes tyranny. He wore religion like armor, using it to deflect every accusation, manipulate every heart, and justify every sin. And yet, for decades, the world looked away, blinded by his rhetoric, comforted by the illusion that a man who preached the Bible could not possibly be evil. But evil often hides behind the holiest masks, and Tony Alamo's was one that promised salvation, but delivered hell instead.
For more than 30 years, Father John Geoghan moved quietly from parish to parish across the Boston Archdiocese. To church records, he was a problem priest. To parents, he was a trusted figure. To children, he was someone they were told never to question. Geoghan's public image was gentle, approachable, and reassuring, the kind of priest invited into homes, schools, and youth programs. He baptized children, heard confessions, and earned the confidence of families who believed the church would never place someone dangerous near their sons. Behind that trust was a pattern of abuse so extensive it would later become one of the most damning institutional failures in modern religious history. By the early 1970s, the Archdiocese of Boston had already received multiple complaints accusing Geoghan of sexually abusing young boys. Parents came forward, victims spoke. Internal files documented credible allegations. What followed was not removal, but relocation. Geoghan was repeatedly transferred to new parishes, often with no warning given to the community. Each move placed him near new children, new families, and new opportunities for abuse. The pulpit protected him. Internal church correspondence later revealed that senior officials knew Geoghan posed a danger. Psychological evaluations described him as a risk to children. Treatment programs failed to stop his behavior, yet, again and again, he was sent back into ministry. Between assignments, Geoghan was sometimes placed in church-run treatment facilities. These stays were framed as rehabilitation, not accountability. When he returned, parents were never told why he had left. The cycle repeated. Victims later described abuse that occurred in rectories, church basements, and even during church-sponsored trips. Some were assaulted repeatedly over years. Many did not understand what was happening, only that the man hurting them wore a collar and spoke for God. Fear kept them silent. When victims did speak, they were often met with disbelief, pressure to forgive, or requests to handle the matter privately for the good of the church. Police were rarely notified. By the time the 1990s arrived, Geoghan had accumulated dozens of accusations. Still, he was not arrested. The institutional logic was consistent: avoid scandal, protect the church, move the priest. That logic collapsed in 2002. A civil lawsuit brought by a former victim forced internal documents into public view. Investigative reporting uncovered the extent of the archdiocese's knowledge, and the deliberate decisions made to conceal it. The public reaction was explosive. Records showed that Geoghan had been accused by over 130 victims, making him one of the most prolific child abusers in U.S. history. The church had known for decades. The question was no longer whether abuse occurred, but why it had been allowed to continue. In 2003, John Geoghan was finally convicted of child molestation and sentenced to prison. Justice arrived late and incomplete. Just 1 year later, while serving his sentence, Geoghan was beaten to death by a fellow inmate. He died without ever facing the full weight of the harm he caused. But the story did not end with him. The scandal forced the resignation of Cardinal Bernard Law, the Archbishop of Boston, after evidence showed he had personally approved Geoghan's transfers, despite knowing the risks. The church issued apologies, policies changed, oversight increased. But for many survivors, the damage was irreversible. They had grown up carrying trauma, shame, and distrust, not only toward the church, but toward authority itself. Some struggled with addiction. Some took their own lives. Others spent decades trying to reconcile faith with betrayal. The erasure in this case was not hidden in darkness. It was documented. It was archived. It was signed and approved. Files existed that could have saved children. They were ignored. John Geoghan did not operate in secrecy. He operated within a system that valued reputation over protection, one that believed silence was safer than truth. Behind the pulpit, he was not just an abuser. He was evidence of what happens when institutions choose containment over courage. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. To the congregation, he was everything a youth pastor should be: charismatic, approachable, and devoted. James J.P. Miller had a presence that drew both teens and parents alike. He smiled icily, offered guidance in times of doubt, and appeared to understand the struggles of young people more than anyone else. His social media profile showcased a life of mentorship, family events, and inspirational messaging. On stage, he preached compassion, accountability, and the transformative power of faith. Behind closed doors, however, a darker story was unfolding, one that would go unnoticed for years. Shielded by authority, loyalty, and institutional inaction, James Miller grew up in the American Midwest, raised in a devout evangelical family. From an early age, he was known for his charm, leadership ability, and natural ability to connect with children and teens. His upbringing emphasized strict adherence to religious morality, personal discipline, and service to the church. These traits, while seemingly positive, would later become tools for manipulation. After attending seminary and earning his credentials as a youth pastor, Miller quickly rose through the ranks of a prominent modern evangelical church. His ability to communicate with young people, his confidence, empathy, and apparent insight made him invaluable. Parents trusted him instinctively, sending their children to youth retreats, leadership workshops, and counseling sessions under his supervision. The church itself elevated him as a model of spiritual leadership. Testimonials on church websites and social media painted him as a mentor committed to shaping the next generation of Christian leaders. At first glance, J.P. Miller seemed like the embodiment of modern pastoral success: educated, media-savvy, and deeply connected to the youth of the congregation. But beneath the carefully curated persona, a pattern of predation was quietly emerging. The first indications of misconduct were subtle. They were easy to dismiss, especially in a religious environment that encouraged trust in authority figures. Some youth reported feeling uncomfortable with prolonged physical contact during counseling sessions or mentorship meetings. Others received late-night messages that blurred the line between pastoral guidance and personal attention. A few students noticed that Miller often requested privacy or one-on-one interactions that seemed unnecessary or overly intimate. Staff began to notice unusual patterns as well. Former assistants recalled Miller keeping extensive records of interactions with teens, including detailed notes about personal vulnerabilities. He seemed to cultivate dependency, positioning himself as the only adult who truly understood the youth. Internal emails showed that concerns were raised about his overfamiliarity, but no formal investigation occurred. The leadership prioritized loyalty over transparency. Church culture, while outwardly promoting accountability, actually insulated him. Praise from the congregation, coupled with his social media persona, made any complaints seem unlikely to gain traction. Staff who suggested caution were warned not to undermine the mission or the vision of God through internal criticism. Over time, the behavior escalated. Victims later testified that Miller deliberately isolated teenagers under the guise of mentorship or spiritual guidance. He used religious language to justify intimate contact, convincing students that closeness with him was a form of spiritual growth. He often framed requests for secrecy as obedience to God, telling youth that disclosure would harm their faith, betray the church, or disrupt God's work. Abuse took multiple forms. Some victims described inappropriate touching and sexual acts during off-site trips and private counseling sessions. Others reported emotional manipulation, including threats of spiritual condemnation and suggestions that their salvation depended on compliance. Text messages, emails, and private social media communications corroborated patterns of coercion. The calculated nature of the abuse made it nearly impossible for victims to speak out, particularly when institutional structures discouraged transparency. Miller's status within the church amplified the abuse. Parents, staff, and fellow pastors were more likely to trust his word than that of a teenager reporting discomfort. He leveraged that trust to isolate victims, gaslight them, and reinforce the notion that speaking out would be sinful or destructive. By the late 2010s, internal staff had documented at least a dozen incidents suggesting misconduct, yet the church did not report any allegations to law enforcement. Emails and internal memos reveal repeated discussions about risk and reputation, with decisions made to handle matters quietly, internally, and privately. Church leadership's response followed a familiar pattern in institutional abuse cases. Complaints were compartmentalized and archived. Leadership discussed interventions but prioritized protecting the church's image over safeguarding victims. Miller was occasionally reassigned or temporarily removed from youth ministry, only to return later. In one internal memo, staff expressed concern that public exposure could damage the ministry's growth. Another highlighted how Miller's media influence made him untouchable. These documents would later become critical evidence, proving that the abuse was known yet unreported for years. The turning point came in 2020, when multiple survivors independently reported abuse to law enforcement. Authorities quickly uncovered digital evidence, texts, emails, and videos, confirming long-term patterns of sexual and emotional manipulation. Survivors testified to overlapping incidents, locations, and methods, establishing a pattern of systematic abuse. Investigators discovered that the church had intentionally avoided reporting allegations, prioritizing internal handling and reputation management over legal obligations. Emails showed staff debates over how to manage complaints, but no one escalated them outside the institution. Once law enforcement intervened, the extent of Miller's abuse became clear. Over a dozen victims ranging from early teens to young adults came forward, describing manipulation, grooming, and sexual abuse that had occurred over several years. Many reported that the trauma affected their education, mental health, and family relationships. In 2021, J.P. Miller was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse, coercion, and exploitation of minors. Court proceedings revealed the depth of institutional complicity. The prosecution presented evidence showing that internal staff had known about the abuse but had failed to act, creating a chain of negligence that allowed the misconduct to continue. During the trial, survivors delivered harrowing testimonies. One described being coerced into silence through spiritual language, Another detailed the way she had been manipulated into believing her abuse was divinely sanctioned. Legal experts noted that the combination of authority, religious influence, and institutional inaction made the abuse uniquely insidious. In 2022, Miller was convicted on several counts of sexual abuse and coercion. He received a prison sentence, marking one of the first modern high-profile cases of a youth pastor in a contemporary evangelical church being held criminally accountable for systematic abuse. The impact on survivors was profound. Many reported lasting psychological trauma, difficulty trusting authority, and estrangement from faith communities. Therapy and survivor networks became essential in helping victims rebuild lives disrupted by manipulation, fear, and coercion. The church issued public apologies and implemented strict safeguarding policies. However, the damage had been done. Policies could prevent future harm, but they could not undo decades of betrayal. Survivors emphasized that the church's internal culture, which prioritized loyalty, reputation, and the appearance of righteousness, had been as harmful as Miller's own actions. Investigative journalism and court filings revealed that the abuse had been institutionally protected rather than hidden. Records existed, but were deliberately unshared with authorities, demonstrating a modern adaptation of an old pattern. Institutions erasing accountability while leaving victims to carry the consequences. The J.P. Miller case highlights a chilling reality of contemporary religious abuse. It does not always occur in secret or behind locked doors. It thrives where authority is unquestioned, loyalty is demanded, and skepticism is discouraged. Institutional systems designed to prevent abuse can instead preserve it when image is valued over safety. The victims remained, carrying trauma, distrust, and questions about faith and morality. They remained even as the church attempted reform. And they remained as evidence of what happens when the pulpit becomes a shield for predation rather than a platform for protection. For modern institutions, the warning is clear. Accountability cannot be outsourced to secrecy. Trust without oversight allows harm to multiply. Reputation without transparency ensures silence. And when leadership fails to act, it is the most vulnerable who bear the cost. In the end, J.P. Miller was brought to justice. But the legacy of his abuse, compounded by decades of institutional complicity, remains with his victims. They are the witnesses to what happens when crimes are facilitated by the very structures meant to prevent them. The pulpit, once a place of safety and guidance, had protected the wrong person for too long, and in that silence, the victims remained. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Before Jonestown became synonymous with mass death, Jim Jones was a pastor revered by thousands. He preached equality, justice, and salvation, promising his followers a world free from racism, poverty, and cruelty. For those who joined the People's Temple, Jones represented hope, a charismatic figure who combined religious fervor with a vision for social reform. Jones began his ministry in the 1950s in Indianapolis, attracting followers from marginalized communities, African Americans, the poor, and the socially disenfranchised. He spoke passionately against injustice and offered a sense of belonging to those who had been ignored by society. His sermons were persuasive, blending Christian doctrine with socialist ideals, and his reach quickly expanded as he relocated to California in the 1960s. While the public saw a compassionate preacher, the inner workings of the People's Temple were far more disturbing. Jones demanded complete loyalty and obedience, fostering a culture where dissent was treated as betrayal. Members were instructed that outside forces were conspiring against them, reinforcing isolation and dependence on his guidance. The pulpit became a tool of control, not merely instruction. Soon, reports of sexual and emotional exploitation began to surface. Survivors later testified that Jones coerced sexual relations with followers, using spiritual rhetoric to suppress resistance. He promised salvation and threatened spiritual damnation, ensuring that victims remained silent. Emotional manipulation accompanied the sexual abuse, with punishments, public humiliation, and isolation employed to maintain control over the congregation. Internal complaints occasionally reached church leaders and associates, but the insular culture of the People's Temple allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. Jones' charisma and outward morality shielded him from scrutiny, while his rhetoric reframed accusations as attacks on faith. Witnesses who attempted to raise concerns were silenced, ostracized, or threatened. Family members of followers were denied access, and reports to law enforcement were minimal and uncoordinated. By the mid-1970s, Jones relocated the People's Temple to a remote settlement in Guyana called Jonestown. Marketed as a utopian socialist community free from oppression, the settlement became a prison under the guise of liberation. Movement was controlled, communication with the outside world was restricted, and armed guards maintained absolute obedience. The pulpit, now amplified over loudspeakers, reinforced fear and devotion daily. Jones rehearsed white knight drills, simulating mass suicide to gauge loyalty and deepen compliance. The warnings from authorities were numerous but fragmented. Allegations of abuse, coercion, and financial exploitation were filed with multiple agencies in the United States, yet jurisdictional and procedural gaps delayed intervention. Families of followers lobbied for investigation, but their concerns were dismissed or minimized by officials wary of infringing on religious freedom. The pulpit had already shielded Jones. Institutional caution and deference allowed abuse to persist without meaningful interruption. On November 18, 1978, the culmination of years of control and manipulation erupted in tragedy. Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Jonestown to investigate allegations of abuse and coercion. Ryan and several associates were murdered at an airstrip by armed members of the temple. Following this, Jones orchestrated what he called a revolutionary act, forcing more than 900 followers, including over 300 children, to ingest poison. Some were coerced, some injected, all victims of a system built on control, fear, and unquestioned authority. The aftermath revealed decades of failures by institutions, authorities, and the organization itself. While Jones' methods were extreme, they were enabled by patterns recognizable in other cases. Internal complaints ignored, victims silenced, oversight avoided, and reputation prioritized over safety. The pulpits and seminaries that had elevated him provided legitimacy, while societal and governmental institutions hesitated until it was too late. Survivors were left with trauma that spanned generations. Children were orphaned, families destroyed, and communities shattered. Many struggled with identity, faith, and mental health long after Jonestown. They were forced to reconcile love for a leader with the horror of his crimes and the betrayal of the institutions that allowed him to operate freely. Jonestown stands as a stark illustration of how unchecked authority behind the pulpit can become lethal. Abuse did not occur in secret or shadows. It unfolded in public view, hidden in plain sight by loyalty, manipulation, and systemic failures. Complaints and warnings existed, yet nothing was sufficient to stop the escalation. The pulpit had not just protected Jones, it had empowered him. The erasure in this case was both bureaucratic and cultural. Records of abuse, reports from concerned members, and warning signs were created, yet they were never acted upon effectively. Institutional mechanisms failed to intervene, relying on the presumption of spiritual authority to excuse inaction. By the time accountability arrived, it was posthumous and incomplete. Jim Jones did not simply commit crimes alone. He thrived within a network of enabling structures, societal deference, and a culture that feared challenging religious authority. He manipulated not only his followers but also the institutions around him, weaponizing trust to devastating effect. The victims remained, carrying trauma, loss, and unanswered questions. Families grieved, children lost to manipulation and coercion. Survivors wrestled with faith and identity. The public confronted horror and disbelief. All the while, the pulpit that had been meant to guide, protect, and comfort had instead become a conduit for harm. Jonestown is a chilling reminder that power without accountability is dangerous, and that authority cloaked in faith can mask manipulation and murder. The case of Jim Jones proves that crimes behind the pulpit are rarely the result of a single individual alone. They are enabled by institutional silence, societal deference, and a misplaced belief that spiritual authority is above scrutiny. In the end, Jim Jones' legacy is not the promise of salvation he preached. It is the lives he destroyed, the communities he shattered, and the lessons of systemic failure that still resonate today. The pulpit had protected him long enough to commit atrocities on an unimaginable scale, and the victims remained silent for decades, until history finally bore witness. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the mid-2010s, Darren Sharp was a rising figure in a large evangelical church in the United Kingdom. Charismatic, articulate, and media-savvy, Sharp drew hundreds of young adults to his ministry every week. Parents trusted him, church members praised his mentorship, and local media featured him as a role model for youth engagement. To outsiders, he was a model pastor, a man whose spiritual guidance and leadership appeared unassailable. Behind closed doors, however, a very different story was unfolding. Sharp targeted young men in his congregation, often those struggling with family issues, identity crises, or social isolation. He positioned himself as a confidant, counselor, and mentor, using the trappings of faith to cultivate dependence and obedience. Emotional manipulation accompanied the grooming. He told victims that questioning his guidance was equivalent to questioning God, that disobedience was sinful, and that their spiritual development required absolute trust. Over several years, the abuse escalated. Victims reported unwanted sexual contact during church retreats, private counseling sessions, and overnight trips. Sharp exploited his position of authority, claiming that these interactions were spiritually sanctioned exercises in trust and obedience. Survivors later described a pervasive fear. Leaving or speaking out meant spiritual condemnation, social ostracization, and loss of community. Internal staff and church leaders were aware of complaints as early as 2016. Emails and meeting notes revealed that concerns were raised about inappropriate behavior, yet no action was taken. Leadership hesitated, citing fear of scandal, reputational damage, and the possibility of false allegations. Records show discussions about temporary reassignment or internal counseling, but no reports were made to law enforcement. Institutional silence allowed the abuse to continue unchecked for years. By 2019, multiple victims had confided in independent authorities and journalists. Evidence included text messages, emails, and corroborating accounts from witnesses who had observed Sharp isolating young men for private mentorship. Survivors provided testimony detailing coercion, emotional abuse, and the systematic use of spiritual authority to silence them. Sharp was arrested in early 2020 and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, exploitation, and abuse of a position of trust. The trial, held in late 2021, revealed extensive institutional complicity. Church staff admitted to knowing about prior allegations but failed to act or report to authorities, allowing the abuse to persist. Survivors described long-term psychological trauma, struggles with trust, and estrangement from religious faith. During proceedings, the court emphasized how spiritual authority can be weaponized, creating coercive environments where victims feel powerless. Experts testified about the unique psychological pressures victims face in faith-based abuse, including fear of divine punishment, spiritual guilt, and community rejection. These factors, combined with institutional silence, made Sharp's crimes both extensive and deeply damaging. Sharp was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Several church officials faced disciplinary measures and legal scrutiny for failing to report known abuse. The case sparked public outrage in the UK, prompting discussions about safeguarding in religious organizations and the need for independent oversight. Church policies were revised to include mandatory reporting, child protection officers, and transparency measures to prevent future abuse. The Darren Sharp case underscores a modern truth. Abuse behind the pulpit does not require secrecy. It thrives where charisma, authority, and institutional deference intersect. Complaints were ignored, warnings dismissed, and internal records archived to protect reputation rather than victims. The pulpit became a shield, ensuring that the abuse could continue under the guise of mentorship and spiritual guidance. Victims continue to live with the impact of trauma. Some became advocates for survivors of faith-based abuse, calling for systemic change. Others struggled privately, attempting to reconcile faith with betrayal. The erasure of accountability, deliberate, systemic, and institutional, prolonged their suffering. Sharp's conviction brought legal justice, but it cannot erase the years of manipulation, fear, and silence. The pulpit, meant to protect and guide, was weaponized to exploit trust, and once again, the victims remained survivors of a system that prioritized reputation over the lives of those most vulnerable. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For years, Dennis Patrick O'Grady moved through Catholic parishes as a trusted presence. He wore the collar. He spoke with calm authority. He listened to confessions, offered guidance, and stood at the center of community life. Parents believed their children were safe around him, Parishioners believed he represented moral certainty. Behind that trust was a pattern of abuse that the church did not stop because it chose not to look too closely. Dennis O'Grady was ordained in the early 1970s and served in multiple parishes across California. From the beginning, his assignments placed him in close contact with children. He worked as a parish priest, had access to youth programs, and regularly interacted with families who viewed him as a spiritual anchor. There was nothing outwardly alarming about him. That was part of what made him dangerous. The first reports of abuse emerged quietly. Children described inappropriate touching. Parents noticed behavioral changes. Some raised concerns to church officials. These were not dramatic accusations shouted from pulpits. They were the kinds of warnings institutions often receive and quietly weigh. And when the archdiocese weighed them, it did not choose transparency. It chose relocation. Rather than reporting O'Grady to police, church leadership reassigned him. He was moved from parish to parish, each time entering a new community that had no knowledge of past allegations. No warnings were issued. No restrictions were placed that would meaningfully limit his access to children. Each transfer was framed as routine, administrative, or pastoral. The abuse continued. Survivors later described how O'Grady exploited religious trust to silence them. He used confession as a space of control. He framed obedience as virtue. Children who tried to speak out were confused, frightened, or dismissed. The power imbalance was absolute, a priest against a child, backed by an institution that did not question him publicly. Internal church records would later reveal that officials were aware of repeated allegations. Some complaints were deemed credible, others were labeled inconclusive. None resulted in immediate action that prioritized child safety. Instead, the church treated O'Grady as a risk to be managed, not a threat to be removed. Silence was policy. Over time, the number of victims grew. Decades passed. The children O'Grady abused became adults carrying trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. Many struggled with depression, addiction, broken relationships, and loss of faith. Some blamed themselves. Others believed no one would ever listen because no one had listened when it mattered. The turning point did not come from within the church. It came from law enforcement. In the 1990s, civil authorities began investigating allegations against O'Grady after victims came forward outside church channels. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. Multiple survivors described similar acts across different parishes and years. The timeline overlapped precisely with O'Grady's quiet reassignments. When police examined church records, the truth became impossible to deny. O'Grady was arrested and charged with numerous counts of child sexual abuse. In court, testimony revealed not only the extent of his crimes, but the length of time they had been known internally. Survivors described abuse that occurred after. Church officials were already aware of allegations of abuse that could have been prevented. In 1998, Dennis O'Grady was convicted and sentenced to prison. The verdict marked a rare moment when justice reached beyond the collar, but it also exposed the depth of institutional failure that had protected him for decades. The archdiocese faced lawsuits. Settlements followed. Apologies were issued. Officials expressed regret for mistakes and failures. Yet for survivors, the language felt insufficient. This was not an error in judgment. It was a repeated decision to prioritize the church's image over children's safety. The aftermath forced painful questions into the open. Why were parents never warned? Why were police excluded? Why was a known abuser allowed to continue ministry? The answers pointed to a culture where the priesthood itself functioned as armor. The belief that the church could handle its problems internally created a closed system, one where abuse could persist as long as it remained quiet. The collar was treated as proof of credibility. The institution was treated as beyond scrutiny. Dennis O'Grady did not act alone, but he was enabled alone. Enabled by silence. Enabled by transfers. Enabled by a system that saw scandal as a greater threat than suffering. His conviction came too late for many of his victims. Justice delayed did not undo childhoods stolen, trust shattered, or faith destroyed. What it did expose was the cost of silence when it is mistaken for sanctity. This case stands as a clear example of how predators thrive, not only through their own actions, but through institutional protection. When authority is assumed to be moral by default, accountability disappears, and it leaves behind a chilling reflection that echoes beyond this one man. When a priest is shielded by God's authority, who is left to shield the child? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Pastor Eddie Long, a once revered figure in American megachurch circles, became a symbol of both spiritual influence and moral controversy. Born in 1953 in Charlotte, North Carolina, Long rose from humble beginnings to lead New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, one of the largest and most influential African American churches in the United States. With a magnetic presence, an authoritative preaching style, and an ability to connect personally with congregants, Long cultivated immense loyalty and trust. However, beneath this exterior of spiritual guidance lay allegations of exploitation and abuse that would challenge the perception of faith, trust, and pastoral authority. Long's ministry grew rapidly during the 1990s and 2000s, fueled by his compelling sermons, community outreach, and ability to inspire devotion among thousands. He emphasized prosperity theology, teaching that faith, obedience, and giving would result in both spiritual and material blessings. The message resonated deeply with congregants, many of whom sought hope, direction, and stability amid socio-economic challenges. Long's charisma and personal attention to members, combined with high-energy worship services, fostered an environment where he was both admired and regarded as infallible. By the mid-2000s, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church had grown into a sprawling institution, boasting tens of thousands of members, multiple campuses, and substantial financial resources. Long leveraged this influence to extend his reach beyond the local congregation, engaging in media appearances, publishing books, and hosting televised sermons. His public persona was that of a devoted pastor, a community leader, and a moral guide whose life exemplified the values he preached. However, in 2010, Long's carefully cultivated image was shattered by a series of lawsuits filed by young men alleging sexual misconduct, coercion, and abuse of authority. The plaintiffs, many of whom were members or former members of the church's youth and leadership programs, claimed that Long had exploited his position of spiritual authority to initiate sexual relationships under the guise of mentorship and guidance. The allegations were deeply disturbing, as they highlighted the ways in which power, trust, and religious authority could be manipulated to prey upon vulnerable individuals. The lawsuit sparked national outrage and intense media scrutiny. Reports detailed how Long's influence within the church created an environment where questioning authority was discouraged, and obedience was framed as a moral and spiritual imperative. Congregants were often taught to view Long's guidance as divinely inspired, which intensified the psychological impact on those alleging abuse. Critics emphasized that Long's dual role as spiritual leader and moral authority amplified his ability to manipulate trust, making the allegations even more shocking. Long initially denied the allegations, framing them as attempts to defame his character and undermine his ministry. However, the sheer number of accusers, combined with corroborating details and investigative reporting, painted a disturbing picture of systemic abuse. The lawsuits were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts, leaving Long facing public condemnation, damaged credibility, and lasting questions about accountability in megachurch settings. The impact on New Birth Missionary Baptist Church and its congregation was profound. Members experienced disillusionment, anger, and betrayal, struggling to reconcile the pastor they had admired with the allegations of abuse. Long's personal charisma, combined with his institutional authority, had fostered deep trust, making the revelations of misconduct all the more painful. Psychologists studying the case emphasized the long-term emotional consequences for congregants, including feelings of guilt, complicity, and shaken faith, beyond the immediate legal and emotional fallout. Long's case sparked broader discussions about oversight, accountability, and the structure of megachurch leadership. Scholars and religious ethicists highlighted the dangers of concentrated authority in large congregations, where the pastor's word is often considered unquestionable and institutional checks are weak or informal. The case prompted calls for stronger governance, independent auditing, and formalized reporting channels to protect congregants from abuse of power. The Long scandal also prompted conversations about the intersection of prosperity theology, charisma, and exploitation. By linking material success and spiritual obedience, leaders could foster environments where questioning authority seemed incompatible with faith. Congregants eager to achieve spiritual and material blessings might overlook or rationalize unethical behavior, highlighting the psychological mechanisms that can facilitate abuse within religious institutions. Despite the scandal, Eddie Long continued to maintain influence within certain circles until his death in 2017, while some congregants remained loyal, citing his prior contributions to their spiritual lives. Others distanced themselves, reflecting on the betrayal of trust and the ethical failures exposed by the lawsuits. Long's story serves as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of faith communities to the misuse of authority and the enduring consequences of spiritual exploitation. The legacy of Eddie Long underscores a central tension in religious leadership. The power to inspire and guide can also be weaponized to exploit and manipulate. His life illustrates how charisma, institutional authority, and perceived moral infallibility can create a dangerous environment for the vulnerable. For survivors, families, and observers, the case offers lessons about vigilance, accountability, and the critical importance of separating personal authority from spiritual influence. Even years after the lawsuits and public scandal, Long's story resonates as a reminder that spiritual leadership carries immense responsibility. When that responsibility is abused, the emotional, psychological, and societal costs are staggering. Communities must balance respect for authority with critical oversight, ensuring that trust is never weaponized for personal gain or gratification. In the end, Pastor Eddie Long's life and ministry challenged the simplest assumptions about faith and morality. He preached salvation, guidance, and divine favor. Yet the allegations and legal settlements reveal a darker reality where trust was manipulated, authority was abused, and faith became a tool for personal exploitation. His story leaves an indelible mark on American religious life, a somber reflection on how those entrusted with spiritual guidance can profoundly betray the very people they claim to serve. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. The stories you've seen today reveal a chilling reality behind the sermons, the smiles, and the promises of salvation. Some pastors exploited faith for wealth, power, and personal gratification. From charismatic megachurch leaders to televangelists with national followings, these individuals manipulated trust, preyed on vulnerability, and left communities grappling with betrayal and disillusionment. Faith is sacred, but when authority is abused, the consequences are real, lasting, and devastating. Subscribe to explore more deep investigations into the hidden truths behind those who claim to lead with morality but act with deception. Like this video if these stories opened your eyes to the dark intersections of faith and power, and share to ensure others are aware of the warning signs and lessons these cases provide. Because when trust is weaponized, vigilance becomes a responsibility, and knowing the truth is the first step toward protecting yourself and your community from those who preach heaven but live in sin.